He reminded her of a version of herself she'd lost somewhere along the way. A maintenance guy, who'd tried to hit on her last month, who'd said she looked like she could use some company. She'd smiled and deflected because she didn't know how to say yes. I need company, not yours, not like that. Everyone would see it. Everyone would know. They'd read it over their morning coffee, pointed out to their roommates, whisper about poor Sarah Chen in 1C who couldn't keep it together. They'd feel sorry for her or judged by her, or burdened by the weight of her need. "Take it down," Sarah said to the empty lobby, her voice cracking. "Please, just take it down." The paper stayed exactly where it was, held by 4 staples that gleamed like accusation. The glass over the board began to fog again, moisture blooming in those finger-like patterns, and Sarah could see words forming in the condensation now. Letters appearing one at a time, written by an invisible hand. Everyone needs help. Everyone is drowning. You are not special in your suffering. You are only special in your silence. The words faded as quickly as they appeared. Sarah had read them, felt them land in her chest like stones dropping into water. The staples glinted. Sarah's reflection showed her standing there in her date-night dress, makeup running now from tears she hadn't realised she was crying, looking small and scared and so desperately alone that it hurt to witness. She should rip it down, grab the paper and tear it to shreds, burn it in her apartment sink, flush the ashes down the toilet, scatter the atoms across the universe until there was no evidence this vulnerability had ever existed. But when she reached for it, her hand stopped an inch from the glass, unable to move closer. Some invisible force, or maybe just her own paralysis, kept her frozen. The air between her hand and the glass felt solid somehow, resistant. She was pressing against a membrane that wouldn't tear. The blank rectangle was back. Right next to her posted plea, another perfect empty space had appeared, waiting. Same dimensions, same depth, same hungry expectation. Sarah understood then, in the way you understand things in nightmares, with a horrible, inevitable clarity that bypassed logic and went straight to instinct. The board wanted another offering, another surrender, another blank page to mark someone's unspoken shame. It was a transaction, a ritual, a rule she hadn't known she was supposed to follow. Her hand dropped to her side. She could feel the words building in her throat. I don't want to bother anyone. 3 times now she'd thought them. 3 times they'd circled in her head like a mantra, like a spell she was casting on herself. Once more and they'd be real, spoken aloud, made solid and permanent and binding. She could feel how badly the lobby wanted her to say them, how the very air seemed to press against her lips, trying to force the words out like a dentist extracting a tooth. The fluorescent light flickered in what might have been encouragement. The staples glinted in what might have been hunger. The rain outside picked up again, drumming against the windows in a rhythm that sounded like chanting. Say it, say it, say it, say it. Sarah clenched her jaw and ran. Her heels skittered on the linoleum as she bolted for the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, not caring about the noise or the way her heart slammed against her ribs like it was trying to escape her chest. She fumbled with her keys at her apartment door, hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the key in the lock. Behind her, she could hear something ascending the stairs. Not footsteps exactly, but a rustling sound, like someone climbing while wrapped in paper. Inside, she slammed the door and threw the deadbolt, the chain, even the little security bar she never used because it seemed paranoid. She stood there in the dark, breathing hard, listening. Her apartment smelled stale, like someone had been living here without opening windows for too long, like desperation and microwave dinners and the particular loneliness of eating alone every night while watching other people's lives play out on screens. At first, nothing. Just the sound of her own gasping breaths and the distant murmur of rain. Then, so soft she almost missed it, the sound of paper rustling, like someone was sorting through a stack, thumbing from page to page, looking for something specific. It was coming from the other side of her door. Sarah pressed her eye to the peephole. The hallway was empty, lit by that same failing fluorescent light that made everything look sickly and wrong, like the world seen through jaundiced eyes. The carpet showed wet footprints leading away from the stairs, her footprints, but nothing else. No paper, no person, no evidence of anything unusual. But the paper rustling sound continued. Now it was joined by another sound, the soft click-snap of a stapler. Someone was pinning things up in the hallway right outside her door, click-snap, rustle, click-snap, rustle, over and over, a rhythm that made her think of breathing, of a heartbeat, something alive and patient and willing to wait forever for what it wanted. "Go away," Sarah whispered against the door. "Please just go away." The sound stopped. In the silence that followed, Sarah held her breath, counting seconds in her head like her therapist had taught her during the panic attacks she'd had back in college. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 4 Mississippi, 5 Mississippi. Then she heard her own voice, tinny and distant, like it was being played from a bad recording on the other side of the door. "I don't want to bother anyone." Sarah's blood went cold. She hadn't said that. Her mouth was pressed shut, teeth clenched so hard her jaw ached, her tongue pressed flat against the roof of her mouth to keep any sound from escaping. She heard it again, clearer this time, unmistakably her voice with her particular inflection, her Midwest vowels that she'd never quite lost despite 5 years in California. "I don't want to bother anyone." The paper rustling started again, faster now, more urgent. Click snap, click snap, click snap, the stapler working overtime like someone on a deadline. And woven through it all, her voice kept repeating that phrase over and over, like a skipping record, like a prayer, like a confession extracted under torture. "I don't want to bother anyone. I don't want to bother anyone. I don't want to bother anyone." Sarah backed away from the door, her hands covering her ears, but she could still hear it. The sound was inside her head now, or maybe it was coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The whole building seemed to be speaking in her voice, using her words, begging in the way she'd taught it to beg through years of self-imposed isolation and pathological independence. She grabbed her phone with shaking hands and scrolled through her contacts with trembling fingers. Who could she call? Who would believe her? Who wouldn't think she was having a breakdown or seeking attention or just being dramatic like her mother always said she was? Her mother! God! Her thumb hovered over the name in her contacts. They hadn't spoken in 2 weeks, not since that uncomfortable dinner where her mother had asked point blank if Sarah was seeing anyone, and Sarah had lied and said she was dating someone casually, and her mother had given her that look, that "I know you're lying" look, and they'd finished the meal in tense silence. Her mother would just tell her she was being dramatic, would suggest she was working too hard, not sleeping enough, drinking too much, would offer to pay for therapy again with that particular tone that suggested Sarah was broken and disappointing and fundamentally unable to handle adult life without intervention. "I don't want to bother anyone," Sarah thought again, and this time she heard it echo back from the walls in her own voice, like the building was agreeing with her, confirming her worst fear, that she was a burden, that reaching out would only make things worse, that she deserved this isolation because she'd chosen it through 1,000 small acts of self-protective withdrawal. Her thumb moved past her mother's name to Jessica, college roommate, best friend for 4 years, then gradually just Christmas cards and birthday texts after graduation. Jessica had gotten married last year, moved to Seattle, started a whole new life that Sarah had only watched from a distance through carefully curated Instagram posts. Sarah had been invited to the wedding, had RSVP'd yes, had cancelled 2 weeks before, claiming a work emergency that was really just her own inability to watch someone else achieve the happiness she couldn't seem to find. She couldn't call Jessica, couldn't interrupt her perfect Seattle life with this mess, this evidence of how far Sarah had fallen. Her thumb kept scrolling, names and numbers, a catalogue of relationships she'd let deteriorate through neglect and fear and the paralysing belief that she didn't deserve connection. A piece of paper slid under her door. Sarah watched it emerge from the gap between door and carpet, white and crisp and deliberate. It scraped across the floor in tiny increments, pushed by unseen fingers, or maybe by the building's own will, its own hunger for her surrender. The paper moved like something alive, undulating slightly as it crossed her threshold, bringing the hallway's intentions into her private space. She didn't want to look at it, didn't want to know what it said, but her feet carried her forward anyway, and she knelt down on her apartment floor in her stupid date-night dress, the one that had cost too much and attracted the wrong kind of attention, and picked up the paper with shaking hands. It was a flyer, formatted just like the ones on the bulletin board downstairs. Professional, clean, merciless in its precision. At the top, in bold letters, needed. Below that, her full name, Sarah Louise Chen, which nobody ever used anymore. Her apartment number, and a list of everything she'd been too scared to ask for. Someone to confirm I still exist. Someone to sit with me while I cry without trying to fix it. Someone to tell me it's okay to not be okay. Someone to help me remember what joy feels like. Someone to care if I disappear because I'm starting to think no one would notice and maybe I'm right. Someone to tell me I'm not being dramatic, that loneliness is real and valid and worth addressing. Someone to forgive me for all the invitations I've declined, all the calls I haven't returned, all the ways I've pushed people away while dying for them to push back. Please, I can't do this alone anymore. I never could. At the bottom, in smaller text, contact Sarah Chen, 1C. She won't ask herself, so the building is asking for her. Sarah crumpled the paper in her fist and threw it across the room with all the force her shaking arm could manage. It bounced off the wall and rolled under her. Ouch, settling into the dust and forgotten things that lived in that dark space. She could still feel its weight, its horrible vulnerability, its accurate assessment of every fear she'd been nursing in the dark. Somewhere in this building, that same flyer was probably pinned to the bulletin board for everyone to see. Her desperation made public. Her loneliness turned into community gossip. Tomorrow morning, the neighbours would gather around it like they'd gathered around accident scenes on the highway, drawn by the spectacle of someone else's disaster, grateful it wasn't theirs. She crawled to her couch and pulled her knees to her chest, making herself as small as possible, trying to compress into a singularity that would collapse inward and disappear. Outside, the rain had picked up again, drumming against her window with renewed intensity. She tried to focus on that sound. Just rain. Normal rain. Nothing supernatural or malevolent about water falling from the sky, just atmospheric pressure and temperature differentials and other things that made scientific sense. But underneath the rain she could hear it. Paper rustling, staples clicking, and her own voice, barely audible but definitely there, begging in an endless loop that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I don't want to bother anyone. I don't want to bother anyone. I don't want to bother anyone. The sounds continued through the night, sometimes loud enough to make her flinch, sometimes so quiet she thought maybe it had stopped. Maybe she'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe this was all just stress and sleep deprivation, and the particular madness of living alone for too long. But it never fully went away. The building had learned her voice now, learned how to shape her words, learned the particular cadence of her shame and loneliness, and carefully cultivated isolation. Around 1 a.m, Sarah heard footsteps in the hallway, heavy boots, probably the maintenance guy doing his late rounds, checking the furnace or fixing a leak or doing whatever maintenance guys did in the small hours when normal people were sleeping. The footsteps paused outside her door and she held her breath, wondering if he could hear the sounds too, wondering if he was reading her flyer right now, wondering if tomorrow he'd look at her differently, with pity or concern or that particular male interest that confused vulnerability with availability. Huh, he heard him mutter through the door. That's new. The footsteps moved on, boots squeaking slightly on the cheap carpet, and Sarah felt something break inside her chest. He'd seen it. The flyer was real. It was actually posted out there. It wasn't just some hallucination brought on by stress and wine and too many lonely nights. The vulnerability was on display, stapled to cork and glass for anyone passing by to read and judge and maybe, possibly respond to. She thought about texting her landlord, demanding he remove it, threatening legal action for, what? Invasion of privacy. How could she prove she hadn't posted it herself? How could she explain that the building had somehow extracted her deepest needs and printed them out without her consent? They'd think she was crazy. Or worse, they'd think she was seeking attention, manufacturing drama, being exactly the kind of high-maintenance tenant that nobody wanted. I don't want to bother anyone, she thought, for what felt like the 100th time that night. I don't want to bother anyone, the walls echoed back, her voice amplified and distorted, bouncing around her apartment like a scream in a canyon, like feedback from a microphone held too close to a speaker. Sarah pressed her hands over her ears and squeezed her eyes shut, but she could still hear it. The building had her voice now, had recorded it, sampled it, learned every inflection and tone and emotional nuance, and it was using that voice to fill the spaces between the walls, bleed into the pipes and vents and electrical systems, become part of the architecture itself. Her loneliness was being absorbed into the foundation, processed into the building's structural integrity, turned into load-bearing isolation. Around 3 a.m, she heard something else. Crying. Soft and muffled like someone trying to keep quiet. It took her a minute to realise the crying was coming from her own throat, that her body had started mourning without consulting her conscious mind, that tears were running down her face and soaking into her expensive dress that she'd probably never wear again because it would always remind her of this night. She didn't sleep, just sat on her couch in her wrinkled date-night dress, watching the sky slowly lighten through her window, listening to the building whisper in her voice, feeling the weight of her exposed need pressing down like atmospheric pressure before a storm. When morning finally came, grey and reluctant, like the sun was embarrassed to show up for this particular day, Sarah forced herself to shower and change into work clothes. She had a presentation at 9, some bullshit about quarterly projections that she'd barely prepared for, because she'd been too busy pretending to have a life that wasn't just work and sleep, and increasingly desperate attempts to manufacture connection through dating apps. She applied makeup with shaking hands, trying to cover the dark circles under her eyes. hollow look that came from a night spent listening to your own voice beg for help you were too scared to accept. The concealer only made her look more corpse-like, more obviously wrong. She wiped it off and gave up, letting her exhaustion show. Let people ask questions. Let them wonder. She was too tired to maintain the performance anymore. She opened her apartment door slowly, half expecting to find the hallway papered in flyers with her name on them, a tunnel of her own desperation leading to the stairs. It looked normal, same stained carpet, same flickering. Fluorescent lights, same scuffed walls with their decades of accumulated paint. No evidence of the nocturnal papering she'd heard all night. No physical proof that anything unusual had occurred. Sarah walked to the stairs quickly, keeping her eyes straight ahead, not letting herself look at apartment doors or corners, or anywhere the building might have left evidence of its work. She made it down one flight without incident, then another. The lobby was just ahead, visible through the stairwell opening, and she could see it from here. A crowd. There were people gathered around the bulletin board even at 7 in the morning. Mrs. Rodriguez was there in her pink bathrobe and fuzzy slippers, the ones with the bunny faces that would have been cute on a child but looked unsettling on a 60-year-old woman. College kids from 4D, backpacks slung over their shoulders, probably on their way to early classes. A guy in a business suit she didn't recognise, briefcase in one hand, coffee in the other. All of them staring at the board, muttering to each other, pointing. Sarah's stomach dropped through the floor and kept going, plummeting toward the Earth's core. She could turn around, go back upstairs, fall in sick, hide in her apartment forever, order groceries online, quit her job, become a hermit. Let the isolation she'd been practicing become complete and permanent. But her feet carried her forward, some horrible compulsion to witness her own exposure, to see exactly how bad it was, to confront the full scope of her humiliation. Like how you can't help touching a bruise even though you know it'll hurt, even though there's no benefit to confirming the damage. Poor girl, Mrs. Rodriguez was saying as Sarah approached, her voice carrying across the lobby with that particular pitch that suggested she was enjoying this, that other people's suffering was entertainment as long as it wasn't yours. I had no idea she was struggling so much, so young and pretty too. You'd think she'd have plenty of friends. Should we check on her? One of the college kids asked, a girl with pink hair and multiple piercings, who'd always seemed kind when they passed in the hallways. Like, what if she's actually not okay? What if this is a cry for help? Don't be ridiculous, the businessman said, his voice dripping with that particular male condescension reserved for young women who express concern. This is probably some kind of art project. Performance art, or whatever young people do now. Social experiment about community or some graduate thesis bullshit. Sarah pushed through the small crowd and they parted for her without seeming to recognise her. She was just another neighbour, another anonymous face in the building despite having lived here for 2 years. The anonymity she'd cultivated so carefully now worked against her. They were reading her most intimate confession without realising the author was standing right there. She stared at the board and felt her knees go weak. The flyer was there, exactly as she'd seen it on the paper that had been slid under her door, kneaded in bold letters, her full name, her apartment number, a list of desperate wants laid out like a menu of human weaknesses. It was pinned right in the centre of the board, commanding prime real estate surrounded by all the other pleas and requests and lost and found notices that formed the building's collective consciousness. But it looked different now in the morning light, less like a violation and more like a confession, an honest admission of need in a sea of careful pretense. The other flyer surrounding it suddenly looked dishonest by comparison, all those euphemistic requests for companionship and someone to talk to that didn't admit the desperate loneliness underneath. The flyer was brutal in its honesty, and there was something almost beautiful about that. Something brave even though she'd never chosen it, and around it, clustering like satellites orbiting a planet, were responses. Dozens of small sticky notes in different handwriting, different colours, different levels of grammatical competence. I'd be happy to talk, seriously, any time. 3F. You're not alone. Text me whenever. I mean it. Derek, 4B. Wednesday coffee, my treat. I've been where you are. Mrs. Rodriguez, 2B. Game night this Saturday if you want to come. No pressure. We play Catan and eat too much pizza. College kids upstairs. Been there. It gets better. Hang in there. You're tougher than you think. 3G. I'm in 2C and I feel this so hard. Maybe we could be lonely together sometime. It sounds sadder than I meant it. Coffee? Jessie. Sarah stood there staring at the notes, her throat tight, her eyes burning with tears she couldn't afford to cry because she had a presentation in 90 minutes, and crying would ruin what little makeup she'd managed. These people, her neighbours, strangers she passed in the hallway without making eye contact, were offering help, Not pity, not judgment, just simple offers of connection. Human beings responding to another human being's admission of need with the most basic kindness. Acknowledgement. "Excuse me," someone said behind her, and Sarah turned to find a young woman with a backpack and tired eyes that suggested she knew exactly what Sarah's flyer meant. "You know who Sarah Chen is? I'd like to leave her a note too. I'm new in the building, and I don't really know anyone yet, and this..." She gestured at the flyer. "This made me feel less alone, like maybe we're all struggling and just not saying it." Sarah opened her mouth to respond. To say what, she wasn't sure. "That's me. I'm Sarah. I didn't write this, but I meant every word. I'm terrified and exhausted and so lonely I could scream." But no words came out. Her voice had abandoned her, fled somewhere the building couldn't sample it and play it back. The young woman waited for a moment, then shrugged and pulled out a pen, scrawling her own message on. A yellow sticky note. "Whatever you're going through, you don't have to go through it alone. First step is the hardest. You already took it." 2F. The woman stuck the note to the board, adding it to the growing collection, and walked away. Sarah watched her go, feeling something shift in her chest. The board had exposed her, yes, had taken her private shame and made it public, had violated her privacy in the most fundamental way. But it had also done something she'd been too scared to do herself. It had asked for help. It had asked and people had answered. Sarah pulled her phone from her purse with trembling hands and found Derek's number, the guy from 4B who'd left his contact info. She didn't know him well, had maybe exchanged 24 words with him in the 2 years she'd lived here, but he'd offered, and she was done pretending she didn't need what was being offered, done performing independence she didn't feel, done choosing isolation over the terrifying vulnerability of connection. Her thumbs hovered over the keyboard. This was it. The moment where she either accepted help or retreated back into the familiar safety of solitude. The moment where she decided whether her exposure would lead to connection or just be another source of shame. "Hi, this is Sarah from 1C. Thanks for the offer. Coffee sometime would be nice." She hit send before she could overthink it, before the voices in her head could remind her that she was bothering him, imposing on his time, being needy and pathetic and weak. The response came within seconds. "Absolutely. How about this afternoon? There's a good place on 5th, 2 p.m. Sarah typed back a yes before she could chicken out, before she could manufacture excuses about work or prior commitments, or any of the 1,000 ways she'd learned to protect herself from the possibility of rejection by rejecting first. She went to work and gave her presentation on autopilot, the numbers and charts blurring together into meaningless data that would be obsolete by next quarter anyway. Her boss complimented her on the thoroughness, said she looked tired and should take better care of herself. Sarah nodded and smiled and got through the day by thinking about the coffee date, about the possibility of connection, about all those sticky notes on the board offering hands to hold in the dark. When she got home that evening, after coffee with Derek, which had been surprisingly easy, surprisingly comfortable, surprisingly honest, she walked straight to the bulletin board. Her flyer was still there, but now it was almost completely covered by responses. She counted 43 separate notes, each one a small act of kindness from a neighbour she'd been living next to in isolation. Each one proof that people were capable of kindness. You just gave them the chance. You let them see your need. She pulled out her own sticky note and pen. She'd stopped at a drugstore on the way home specifically for this, specifically to participate in this strange ritual of vulnerability and response, and wrote, "Thank you, all of you. You have no idea what this means. I spent last night listening to the building use my voice to beg for help, and this morning you answered. I'm still scared and still lonely, but maybe a little less alone. Sarah." She stuck it to the board next to all the others, and as she stepped back, she felt lighter. The building had forced her vulnerability into the open, violated her privacy and exposed her shame, but it had also shown her something she'd forgotten. That needing people wasn't shameful, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was let yourself be helped. That isolation was a choice you could unmake. That connection was available if you were willing to risk the exposure it required. Sarah went upstairs to her apartment and opened her door. The sounds from last night were gone. No paper rustling, no staplers clicking, no disembodied voice begging in her tone. The building was quiet, almost peaceful, like it had gotten what it wanted and moved on to other prey. She'd passed some kind of test. Had survived the board's exposure and found community on the other side. She felt exhausted but clean, like she'd survived a fever that had burned away something toxic, like she'd been forced to lance an infection she'd been pretending didn't exist. But on the second floor, in apartment 2E, James Wu was just beginning to understand that the building had noticed him too. James had lived in the building for 6 months and had perfected the art of being invisible. not just introverted, invisible. He'd mastered the timing of leaving his apartment so he'd never encounter neighbours in the hallway. He knew when Mrs. Rodriguez checked her mail, when the college kids came and went, when the maintenance guy made his rounds. He'd optimised his existence to minimise human contact, and he was proud of that optimisation, the way some people were proud of their marathon times or their cooking skills. He worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, which meant he could go days without speaking to another human being. Clients communicated via email. Groceries arrived via delivery apps. Even his therapist, when he bothered to make appointments, met with him over Zoom so he never had to leave his apartment or dress appropriately below the waist. He'd seen the commotion around Sarah Chen's flyer this morning, had watched from the stairwell as neighbours gathered and responded, had observed the whole thing with anthropological detachment, like he was studying some primitive ritual from a culture he didn't belong to. People were so desperate for connection, he thought, so needy, so unable to handle being alone with themselves. James had congratulated himself on being above all that, on being self-sufficient and independent and not requiring constant validation from others. He went back to his apartment and worked on his designs, ate instant ramen for lunch, the good kind from the Japanese market, not the cheap shit. Sent his mother's calls straight to voicemail when she rang at 2 p.m. like she did every Tuesday without fail. What James didn't notice was the board watching him through the walls, didn't feel its attention settling on him like a weight, like atmospheric pressure changing before a storm. Didn't understand that his aggressive self-sufficiency was exactly the kind of thing that interested the board, that drew its hunger the way blood draws sharks. The first flyer appeared under his door that night around 11. James was working late on a logo redesign for a crypto startup that would probably implode within 6 months, his screens casting blue light across his dark apartment like aquariums. He heard the soft scrape of paper on carpet, a sound that shouldn't have been possible since all his neighbours should be asleep, and frowned, getting up from his expensive ergonomic desk chair to investigate. There was a lost notice for a cat, named Mittens. White cat with grey spots, answers to Mittens, missed by family in 3B, please call if found. James didn't own a cat, didn't know anyone who owned a cat, didn't care about cats in general, though he admitted they had good branding from an internet perspective. He had no idea why someone would slide this under his door. He crumpled it and threw it in the recycling. He was conscientious about recycling even if he wasn't conscientious about human relationships, chalking it up to a neighbour's mistake. Maybe they'd meant to slide it under every door and his just happened to be one of them. The next night, another flyer, this one advertising guitar lessons from someone in 3B. $30 per hour, all skill levels welcome, first lesson free. Again, not relevant to James, who had no interest in learning guitar or any instrument. He'd tried piano as a kid and discovered he had perfect pitch, but no passion, which his father had said was worse than having passion but no talent. Into the recycling it went. The third night, 3 flyers, a request for help moving furniture on Saturday morning, a thank you note for someone who'd found a lost wallet, and an ad for a roommate wanted in a 2-bedroom on the 4th floor. James started to get annoyed. Was someone fucking with him? Playing some kind of prank? He opened his door to catch whoever was leaving these papers, ready to confront them about wasting his time, but the hallway was empty. Completely, eerily empty. Lit by that perpetually dying fluorescent light that made everything look like a crime scene photograph. By the end of the week, he was finding 5 or 6 flyers under his door every night. None of them relevant, all of them seemingly random selections from the bulletin board downstairs. James started leaving them in a pile by the door, not bothering to recycle them anymore. Let them accumulate. Maybe whoever was doing this would get bored and stop. People always got bored eventually, it was one of the few reliable truths about human behaviour. Then came the night of the first personal flyer. James was brushing his teeth before bed, his phone playing a podcast about productivity optimization, the science of flow states, when he heard the familiar scrape of paper under his door. He spat toothpaste into the sink. He used expensive Japanese toothpaste that supposedly prevented gum disease through some process he didn't fully understand but trusted because it cost 4 times as much as regular toothpaste, and went to collect the nightly deposit expecting more random notices. This one was different. Lost. James Wu's connection to other people, last seen 6 months ago when he moved in, and decided isolation was easier than disappointment. If found, please don't bother returning. He doesn't want it anyway. He never did. James read it 3 times, his hands starting to shake, his carefully regulated heartbeat spiking in a way his fitness tracker would flag as anomalous. This wasn't random. This was targeted. Someone in the building was watching him, judging him, making commentary on his lifestyle choices, on the very deliberate decisions he'd made about how to live his life. He crumpled the flyer and threw it toward the recycling bin, but his hands were shaking and it bounced off the rim and landed on his kitchen floor, still partially readable. The words, "he doesn't want it anyway," stared up at him like an accusation. James picked up the flyer and tore it into tiny pieces, then flushed the pieces down the toilet, watching them swirl away like evidence of a crime. Some asshole neighbour with too much time on their hands was trying to make him feel bad about keeping to himself. Well, fuck them. He didn't owe anyone his time or attention or emotional energy. He was an adult who'd made a conscious choice to prioritise solitude over the exhausting performance of community. That was his right. That was healthy boundary setting. That was self-care. He went to bed angry, and woke up to his phone buzzing with increasing urgency. 7 missed calls from his mum, 12 texts asking why he never answered. Was he okay? Did he hate her? What had she done wrong? Was it because she'd remarried too quickly after Dad died? Was he punishing her for moving on with her life? James groaned and sent back a quick, "I'm fine, just busy with work," before muting the conversation. He didn't have the energy for his mother's emotional neediness right now. She'd survived 58 years on this planet without his constant attention. She could handle him not answering the phone for a few days. She had her new husband to talk to. She didn't need James to be her emotional support son anymore. The board in the lobby flickered its fluorescent approval of his decision. That night, James found 3 more personalised flyers under his door. He picked them up with a growing sense of dread, his hands steadier now because anger had replaced fear. Needed someone to check on James. Woo? 2? Because he hasn't spoken to another human being in person for 9 days and counting. Someone to verify he still remembers how to use his voice for something other than delivery confirmations. Lost. James Woo's ability to ask for help, last seen in childhood before his father taught him that needing people makes you weak, before he learned that vulnerability is failure and independence is the only virtue worth cultivating. Needed. Someone to tell James Woo that his mother calls because she loves him, not because she's trying to burden him. Someone to explain that answering the phone won't kill him, but loneliness might. Someone to help him understand the difference between solitude and isolation before it's too late. James stared at the flyers, his heart pounding in his ears, his breath coming short and fast in a way that reminded him of the panic attacks he used to have before he learned to control them through breathing exercises and cognitive behavioural therapy techniques. These weren't just observations. They were specific, intimate, impossibly accurate. No one in this building knew about his father's philosophy on self-reliance, the constant lectures about how real men didn't need anyone, how asking for help was admitting weakness, how his father had survived career and built a successful business and raised 2 kids mostly alone after Mum got sick. And if he could do all that without whining about needing support, then James had no excuse. No one knew he'd been counting the days since his last in-person conversation, tracking it in a spreadsheet because he tracked everything, because data made him feel in control. No one knew about the complicated knot of guilt and resentment he felt every time his mother's name appeared on his phone screen. Guilt because she deserved better than a son who avoided her. Resentment because she'd remarried so quickly after Dad died, like she'd been waiting for him to die so she could finally be happy. James grabbed the flyers and marched downstairs to the lobby, his jaw clenched so tight his molars hurt, determined to rip down whatever the fuck was on the bulletin board, to confront whoever was doing this psychological torture, to assert control over a situation that was spiralling into chaos. The lobby was empty at midnight, just the fluorescent light and the rain, and that goddamn board staring at him like a patient predator. James searched the board for flyers about him, expecting to see his private life on display like Sarah Chen's had been. There was nothing. No mention of his name, no needed or lost notices bearing his apartment number. The board looked completely normal, just the usual chaos of community requests and advertisements, plus Sarah's flyer now buried under dozens of supportive responses that made James feel vaguely nauseated with their performative kindness. He stood there, breathing hard, staring at the cork and glass and staples. The board stared back, impassive and patient and somehow knowing. The fluorescent light above it flickered in what might have been amusement. "I know you're fucking with me," James said to the empty lobby, his voice echoing in the space in a way that made him sound younger than he was, more vulnerable than he wanted to be. "I don't know how, but I know it's you." The fluorescent light flickered in response. Maybe it was just doing what it always did, dying slowly over decades, burning out one filament at a time. The staples glinted. James felt watched, assessed, measured and found wanting. Like the board was taking his inventory and calculating his worth in units of connection, and finding him bankruptly isolated. He went back to his apartment and triple-locked the door, deadbolt chain. the security bar he'd installed himself even though the lease technically didn't allow permanent modifications. The flyers he'd brought downstairs sat on his kitchen counter, mocking him with their accurate insights, reflecting back. Truths he'd spent years trying to bury. Someone to check on James Wu because he hasn't spoken to another human being in person for 9 days. Was it 9 days? James pulled up his spreadsheet, the one he used to track his human interactions, because that's what you did when you wanted to optimize anything. You measured it. The last time he'd talked to someone face-to-face was the delivery driver who'd handed him his Thai food order last Tuesday. Before that, the super who'd knocked on his door about the water bill on Sunday. Before that, 9 days since Tuesday. Somehow, someone was counting. Someone was watching. Someone was keeping the same spreadsheet he was. James grabbed his laptop and opened a new document, started typing furiously. He'd document everything. Every flyer, every detail, every timeline. He'd figure out who was doing this and he'd expose them. Maybe even sue them for harassment. You couldn't just psychologically torment your neighbours and get away with it. There were laws, privacy laws, harassment laws. He'd done a project on HIPAA compliance once. He knew about privacy protections. His fingers flew across the keyboard, but as he typed, he started to notice something strange. The words on the screen weren't quite what he meant to write. He'd type, "This is clearly a targeted harassment campaign," and the screen would show, "This is clearly someone trying to help." He'd correct it, backspace carefully, retype, but the words would shift again as soon as he looked away, subtle changes that altered the meaning from accusation to admission. James closed the laptop hard enough that he worried briefly about damaging the screen. Maybe he was more tired than he thought. Maybe the stress was getting to him. Human brain was fallible. He knew that. Pattern recognition gone wrong, confirmation bias, sleep deprivation causing mild hallucinations. He'd deal with this in the morning when his head was clearer and his blood glucose was stable, but sleep didn't come. He lay in bed staring at his ceiling, watching shadows from passing cars sweep across the textured surface, listening to the building settle around him. Old buildings made weird sounds. Pipes settling, wood expanding and contracting with temperature changes, rodents in the walls. Normal building noises that his stressed brain was interpreting as something sinister. Around 2 a.m, he heard it clearly. The soft rustle of paper, not the scurrying of rodents. Paper. Specific. Unmistakable. The sound of pages being turned or sorted. It was coming from inside his walls, like someone was sitting in the space between the studs and drywall, going through documents, organising files. James sat up, his heart rate spiking, his fitness tracker vibrating against his wrist to alert him to the unusual cardiac activity. Old buildings made weird sounds, he reminded himself. Pipes settling, wood expanding, rodents. It was probably nothing, just normal building noises that his stressed brain was interpreting as something sinister. The rustling continued, now joined by a familiar sound. Click-snap, click-snap, click-snap. A stapler. Someone was using a stapler inside his walls. "Fuck this," James muttered, climbing out of bed. He'd had enough. Enough of the flyers, enough of the mind games, enough of this whole creepy building with its dying fluorescent lights, and its creepy bulletin board, and its bizarrely intimate knowledge of his life. He'd break his lease if he had to, move back in with his mother temporarily, despite how much he'd hate that, take the financial hit. Money was replaceable. Mental health was priceless. He'd read that somewhere, probably on one of the productivity blogs he followed. He went to his front door, intending to storm down to the lobby and call the police, report harassment, get this on record so when he broke his lease, he'd have documentation that it was the building's fault. But when he grabbed the doorknob, it wouldn't turn. The lock was disengaged. He could see that clearly. He could see the bolt retracted into the door, but the knob itself wouldn't budge. It felt stuck, or frozen, or like the building itself was holding it shut. James yanked harder, throwing his weight against the door, using the leg strength he'd built through his optimized exercise routine. Nothing. The door stayed shut like it was part of the wall now, like the opening had been sealed over. "Let me out," he shouted, pounding on the door with his fists, not caring any more about bothering his neighbours, about maintaining his carefully cultivated invisibility. "Let me the fuck out!" The paper rustling in the walls intensified, spreading from one wall to another until it surrounded him, coming from all 4 walls simultaneously like he was inside a box made of filing cabinets. The click-snap of staples joined in from all directions, a percussion section of metal through cork and paper and drywall, rhythmic and purposeful. And underneath it all, James heard something that made his blood run cold. His own voice. Not words, exactly. More like fragments. syllables and sounds pulled from phone calls and muttered curses, and the particular way he said "fine" when he clearly wasn't fine, when fine was a wall he put up between himself and anyone who might care. The building had been listening, collecting, recording, sampling his voice like a DJ sampling beats, and now it was playing it back in a disjointed chorus that seemed to come from every surface. Fine, don't need, leave me alone, I'm fine, don't want to bother. Fine, 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 don't need anyone, perfectly fine alone. James backed away from the door, his heart slamming against his ribs hard enough that he thought briefly about cardiac events, about dying alone in his apartment and no one noticing for days until the smell alerted the neighbours. His back hit the wall that was rustling with paper, and he jerked forward like he'd been burned. This wasn't possible. Buildings didn't record your voice, walls didn't collect your words and play them back. This was some kind of elaborate prank, or he was having a psychotic break, or he'd been drugged somehow, or... The doorknob turned on its own, slowly, deliberately, like invisible fingers were twisting it from the outside. The door swung open into the hallway, and James could see the corridor beyond, lit by that sickly fluorescent light that made everything look diseased. The hallway floor was covered in flyers, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, overlapping like scales on a fish or shingles on a roof, all of them white, all of them crisp, all of them about him. James could see his name repeated over and over in different fonts and sizes. James Wu, James Wu, James Wu, Apartment 2E, needed and lost in bold letters that got bigger the farther down the hallway they went. He stepped into the hallway. He had to see, had to understand what was happening, even though every instinct screamed at him to barricade himself in his apartment and wait for morning, and the paper crinkled under his bare feet. Each flyer was slightly different, each one exposing a different piece of his carefully constructed isolation, each one a document from a file he'd thought was sealed. Needed. Someone to tell James that working from home doesn't have to mean cutting off all human contact, that optimization isn't the same as living, that efficiency doesn't equal happiness. Lost. James Wu's birthday. He hasn't told anyone when it is because parties are exhausting, and he doesn't want to burden people with expectations of gifts and attendance. No one knows to celebrate with him. He turned 32 last month and spent it alone, which is exactly what he wanted until it wasn't. Needed. Someone to explain to James that his father was wrong. Needing people isn't weakness, it's just being human. That his father's stoicism was trauma, not strength. You can admire someone and also acknowledge they damaged you. Lost. James's college friends. He stopped returning their calls 3 years ago and now he can't remember why. He tells himself they grew apart naturally, but the truth is he stopped trying and waited for them to stop trying too. It worked. Needed. Someone to sit with James while he admits that his girlfriend didn't leave because she didn't love him. She left because he wouldn't let her in. He chose isolation over vulnerability and called it maturity. James walked down the hallway reading flyers, his vision blurring with tears he refused to acknowledge, as crying was weakness, and weakness was failure. Every exposure was true. Every vulnerable detail was something he'd buried so deep he'd almost forgotten it existed, archived in mental filing cabinets he never opened. The building remembered. The board remembered. The building had been doing his spreadsheet better than he'd been doing his spreadsheet. He made it to the stairwell and looked down. The stairs were covered in flyers too, a paper waterfall descending toward the lobby. James could see more of his secrets on every step. Truths arranged in descending order of severity. Needed. Someone to ask James if he's okay, because the answer is no, but he'll say yes anyway, because saying yes is habit and honesty is risk. Lost. James's ability to enjoy anything. He can't remember the last time he felt genuinely happy. He can identify satisfaction at completing tasks, relief at avoiding social obligations, but joy? That's been missing so long he's forgotten what it feels like. Needed. Someone to hold James while he finally admits he's been drowning for years. That optimization is just control, and control is just fear, and fear is what happens when you lose your father and decide never to lose anyone else by never letting anyone close. Lost. James's last hug. It was 8 months ago, his mother at the airport when he flew out to help her move. She said, "I love you," and he said travel safe because the only love language he'd learned was practical service. James sat down on the top step, his bare feet cold against the paper-covered stairs, and put his head in his hands. The building was cataloguing his loneliness, documenting his isolation, turning his careful independence into a museum exhibit of everything he'd given up to avoid the possibility of pain. Every choice he'd made to protect himself was being displayed as evidence of self-destruction. And the worst part, the part that made him want to scream until his throat bled, was that it was all true. Every word, every observation. He was drowning. He had cut everyone off. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt genuinely connected to another human being. He'd turned isolation into a religion and practiced it with devotional intensity. I don't want to bother anyone, he thought, and the building sighed in satisfaction, like it had been waiting for that exact thought, like that was the password to the next level of whatever game this was. The flyers on the stairs began to move, not just settling or sliding, moving purposefully, deliberately. They climbed up his legs like living things, wrapping around his shins, his thighs, his waist. James tried to brush them away, but they stuck to his hands, adhered to his skin like they were wet or adhesive or just determined, like they wanted to bond with him, become part of him. I don't want to bother anyone, James whispered, and the building echoed it back in his own voice, louder now, more certain, amplified through pipes and vents and ductwork. I don't want to bother anyone. The flyers kept coming, covering his chest, his shoulders, his neck. Each one a true thing he'd never admitted, a need he'd never acknowledged, a cry for help he'd never let himself voice, because voicing needs was weakness, and he'd built his entire identity around not being weak. They were suffocating him, burying him under the weight of his own denied vulnerability, creating a paper cocoon that would either kill him or transform him. I don't want to bother anyone, James screamed, and the hallway lights flickered wildly, throwing everything into strobing madness, like a rave or a seizure or the end of the world. When the lights steadied, James was gone from the stairwell. The flyers remained, scattered across the steps like leaves after a storm, but they were blank now, white pages with no text, empty testimony to something that had happened but left no readable evidence. In the lobby, the bulletin board's glass had fogged over completely, condensation covering the surface so thickly you couldn't see the flyers underneath. And if you looked closely, if you really looked, if you were brave enough or foolish enough to get that close, you could see a shadow behind the glass. Tall and thin and made of layered paper, it stood perfectly still, like it was waiting. Like it had always been waiting, like it would wait forever if necessary, because time meant nothing to things made of paper and need. In apartment 2E, James's laptop sat open on his desk, his unfinished documentation still on the screen. But the words had changed, rewritten by some invisible editor with access to his true thoughts. This is clearly someone trying to help. I haven't spoken to another person face to face in 9 days, and I've been counting like it's an achievement instead of a symptom. My mother loves me, and I keep sending her to voicemail like love is a burden instead of a gift. I'm drowning, and I call it independence because that sounds better than admitting I'm scared. Scared of rejection, scared of loss, scared of caring about someone enough that losing them would destroy me like losing Dad destroyed me even though I pretend it didn't. I don't want to bother anyone, which is another way of saying I'm too scared to ask for the help I desperately need. But bothering people is what people do. That's what community means. That's what family means. That's what being human means. Someone please check on me. Someone please care. Someone please notice I'm missing before I disappear completely. I can't do this alone anymore, but I don't know how to stop pretending that I can. The document saved itself. The laptop went to sleep, its screen going dark like an eye closing. The next morning, Derek from 4B knocked on James's door on his way to work. He'd noticed James's mail piling up in the lobby. 3 days worth now, mostly junk, but also what looked like an important envelope from the IRS. He'd seen the guy's lights on at all hours, visible through the gap under the door, and had felt vaguely worried in that neighbourly way you feel about people you don't really know but share walls with. "James?" Derek called through the door, knocking again. "You okay in there, man? Your mail's piling up." No answer, just silence, a particular quality of silence that feels wrong. It feels like absence rather than quiet. Derek knocked again, louder this time, using his full fist instead of polite knuckles. "James, it's Derek from upstairs, just checking on you." Still nothing. Derek tried the doorknob and found it unlocked, which was weird because James seemed like the kind of guy who'd have 3 locks and maybe a security bar. He pushed the door open cautiously, calling out as he entered, his phone already in his hand in case he needed to call 911. "James, it's Derek, just checking on you. Your door was open." The apartment was empty, not abandoned empty. All the furniture was there, all James's stuff, his expensive Japanese art prints on the walls, his gaming PC still humming quietly on the desk. But empty of James himself. The bed was unmade but didn't look slept in, just rumpled, like someone had sat on it. Computer on the desk, a half-empty coffee mug next to it going mouldy, the coffee long since evaporated into a ring of brown residue. Everything else neat and organised in that way of people, who live alone and have nothing to distract them from their domestic perfection. Derek walked through the apartment, his unease growing with each empty room. The bathroom was pristine, towels folded perfectly, no water in the shower. Closet still full of clothes arranged by colour and season. James's wallet sat on the kitchen counter next to his keys, his driver's licence visible through the clear pocket. His phone was plugged in by the bed, fully charged, lock screen showing 17 missed calls from Mum. James himself was nowhere. Vanished. Like he'd stepped out of his life and forgotten to come back, or been forcibly removed by something that left no evidence of struggle. Derek called the police. They came, 2 uniformed officers who looked bored until they saw the 17 missed calls from Mum, took a report, noted the unlocked door and the absence of any signs of struggle. They'd keep an eye out, they said, check local hospitals, put out a bolo, and adults were allowed to disappear if they wanted to. Happened all the time, especially in big cities. People got overwhelmed and just left, started over somewhere else. It wasn't illegal to ghost your own life. Any history of mental illness? The older cop asked, his pen poised over his notebook. I don't know, Derek admitted. I barely knew the guy. We lived in the same building, but he kept to himself. Family we should contact? His mum's been calling. Number's in his phone. Cops took the phone, noted the contact information, said someone would reach out. Then they left, and Derek was alone in James's apartment, surrounded by evidence of a life lived but not witnessed. James's mother arrived 2 days later, having driven 16 hours straight from Portland when the police finally reached her. She was small and tired and had that particular devastation in her eyes that comes from losing someone twice, once when they pull away emotionally, once when they vanish physically. Derek met her outside apartment 2E and helped her pack up James's belongings, neither of them mentioning the weird detail that everything in the apartment looked lived in, except for the person who'd been living there. They packed in silence mostly, Mrs. Wu occasionally picking up an object, a coffee mug, a framed photo from James's college graduation, a book with a receipt serving as a bookmark, and crying quietly before placing it in a box. He's always been such a loner, she said at one point, her voice shaking as she folded her son's shirts, each one exactly the same shade of grey or black or dark blue. Ever since his father died, he just pulled away from everyone. I tried to stay close, but he kept pushing me back, and I didn't know how to help without making it worse. I didn't know if I should give him space or insist on connection. I chose space, and now... She didn't finish the sentence, just folded another shirt and placed it carefully in the box. Eric nodded sympathetically, though he'd barely known James beyond seeing him occasionally in the hallway, always with his head down, always avoiding eye contact. I'm sure he'll turn up. Maybe he just needed some space to clear his head, some time to figure things out. But even as he said it, Derek didn't believe it. There was something wrong about the whole situation, something that reminded him of old horror movies where people vanished from locked rooms and left no trace, except the lingering feeling that the walls themselves had swallowed them whole. Something that made him think of Sarah Chen's flyer on the bulletin board, her admission of desperate need, and how the building had somehow known to expose her. After Mrs. Wu left with the last box of belongings, Derek stood in the empty apartment for a moment. All of James's stuff was gone, but the space still felt occupied somehow. Still felt like someone was there, just out of sight, just behind the walls. Derek walked down to the lobby and stood in front of the bulletin board. He'd added his own sticky note to Sarah Chen's flyer last week. Had actually gotten coffee with her yesterday afternoon. She was nice, funny and self-deprecating, and refreshingly honest about how much she'd been struggling. They'd made plans to get coffee again next week. She'd seemed lighter somehow, like exposing her vulnerability had let some pressure out. Derek studied the board, looking for any mention of James Wu. Nothing obvious. The board was its usual mess of lost pets and needed rides and thank yous. Normal. Except, in the centre column, where all the needed notices clustered, there was a new flyer. It was printed on slightly yellowed paper, like it had been there for ages, even though Derek was certain, almost certain, it hadn't been there yesterday. Lost. James Wu. Last seen in 2E before he said the words. Before he admitted he didn't want to bother anyone and meant it so completely, the building took him at his word. If found, please teach him that. Asking for help isn't the same as being a burden. Reward. He gets to exist again. He gets to take up space. He gets to matter. Derek reached out to touch the flyer, compelled by something he couldn't name, but his hand stopped an inch from the glass, unable to move closer. The air between his hand and the glass felt solid somehow, resistant, like there was an invisible barrier protecting the board from interference. The board hummed with a sound just below the range of hearing, a vibration he felt in his bones rather than heard with his ears, and Derek suddenly understood, really understood, that this wasn't just a bulletin board. It was something else, something hungry, something that fed on isolation and shame and the particular kind of loneliness that comes from choosing to be alone because connection is too scary. He backed away slowly, his heart pounding, then turned and climbed the stairs to his apartment, making sure to lock the door behind him. Deadbolt and chain, though. He wasn't sure locks would matter against something that could speak through walls and collect people who isolated themselves too completely. As he stood there in his living room, pulse racing, Derek made a decision. He would pay attention to his neighbours from now on, would check in, would ask if people were okay, would create the kind of community where nobody had to vanish into the walls because they were too proud or scared or broken to ask for help, would break through the polite fiction of urban privacy and actually give a shit about the people he shared this building with. It was the least he could do. For James, for Sarah, for whoever the board noticed next, because there would be a next person. Derek could feel it in the way the building settled around him, in the soft rustle of paper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere, in the faint click-snap of staples that echoed in the walls at night like a heartbeat. The board was always watching, always waiting, always. Hungry for the people who swallowed their needs and called it strength, who chose isolation and called it independence, who spent their lives saying, "I don't want to bother anyone," until the words became truth and the building made them disappear. Derek pulled out his phone and texted Sarah. "Coffee again tomorrow? Want to talk about starting some kind of building community thing? Game nights maybe, or just regular check-ins? This place feels too isolated." Her response came quickly. "Yes, I've been thinking the same thing. Maybe we could start with a building dinner. Get people actually talking to each other." Derek smiled and typed back his agreement. It wasn't much. Probably wouldn't save anyone. But it was something. A small act of resistance against the isolation the building seemed to feed on. And in the lobby, the board flickered with something that might have been approval or might have been hunger. Hard to tell the difference sometimes. The staples glinted, the glass fogged, slightly from the inside. And behind all the flyers, in the space between cork and glass where shadows lived, something tall and made of paper smiled with a mouthful of staple teeth and waited. Because that's what it did. Waited. Collected. Archived every moment of denied need, every swallowed plea for help, every time someone thought "I don't want to bother anyone," and meant it so completely they started to disappear. The building remembered everything. The board forgot nothing. And somewhere in the space between cork and glass, Staple Mercy kept adding to its collection, filing away people who refused to file their own needs, cataloguing the disappeared in perfectly organised columns. Lost, needed, please. In the rain-dim lobby, it didn't punish you for needing help. It just collected the moment you denied it, and pinned that denial up until the building started asking in your name. And if you never answered the building's ask, if you kept insisting you were fine alone, then eventually you became part of the walls, part of the architecture, part of the permanent collection. Your voice absorbed into the pipes, your needs filed between the studs, your loneliness load-bearing and structural, forever, continued. The building dinner happened 3 weeks after James Wu disappeared. Derek and Sarah co-organised it, sending flyers under every door, real flyers, printed on Derek's printer, nothing supernatural about them except maybe the determination behind them. Building potluck, 6 p.m. Saturday, lobby. Bring food and your beautiful self. Let's actually meet each other. 17 people showed up, which was more than Derek expected from a building of 32 units. Mrs. Rodriguez brought pozole, enough to feed an army. College kids brought pizza and cheap beer. Sarah made a salad that was actually good, with ingredients that suggested effort. Derek contributed buffalo wings from the place on 5th. Other people brought pasta, cookies, fruit, things. From the store, still in their plastic containers, because not everyone could cook, but everyone could contribute. They pushed the mail table against the wall and arranged the food there, creating a buffet line. People stood around awkwardly at first, the way adults do when forced into social situations without alcohol to ease the transition. But then Mrs. Rodriguez started telling a story about the building in the 80s, back when it was mostly artists and musicians, before the neighbourhood gentrified and rent got too high for anyone creative, and people started laughing, started talking, started being humans together instead of isolated units filing past each other in hallways. The bulletin board watched it all with its glass eye, the fluorescent light above it flickering less than usual, like even it appreciated the gathering. Like maybe community was the antidote it had been waiting for someone to discover. But in apartment 3F, Melissa Torres was discovering that some isolations couldn't be solved by potlucks. She'd gotten the flyer about the building dinner, had even considered going, had gotten as far as putting on real clothes instead of the sweatpants she'd been living in for 3 days. But then she'd looked at herself in the mirror, really looked, and seen what everyone else would see. The weight she'd gained since her miscarriage, the way her clothes didn't fit right anymore, the exhaustion in her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide, I don't want to bother anyone with my problem, she thought, and took off the real clothes and put the sweatpants back on. Downstairs, the board's fluorescent light flickered once, like a computer registering new input. Melissa had been pregnant for 11 weeks before the bleeding started. Not long enough to tell most people, but long enough that she and Marcus, her boyfriend of 2 years, not the Marcus in 3G, but a different Marcus who'd moved across the country for a job opportunity he swore was temporary, had started making plans. Names, paint colours for the nursery, budgets for childcare, then the bleeding, the emergency room, the doctor's careful voice explaining that these things happened, it was no one's fault, that she could try again. Marcus had been sympathetic on the phone, had offered to fly back, but Melissa had said no, said she was fine, said she didn't want him to lose the opportunity, said all the things you're supposed to say when you're being brave and self-sufficient. That was 3 months ago. Marcus called less frequently now. The last conversation had been mostly about his new apartment, his new gym, his new work friends. He'd asked how she was doing, and she'd said, fine, because what else was there to say? She still cried every time she saw a pregnant woman. She'd packed up the baby name book she'd been annotating. She felt like a failure in the most fundamental biological way. I don't want to bother anyone with my problems. The thought had become automatic, a reflex like pulling your hand away from heat. She'd stopped answering calls from her sister, cancelled therapy appointments because talking about it made it more real. Had told her boss she was fine to work full-time even though some days she could barely get out of bed. Melissa sat on her couch and listened to the sounds of the potluck filtering up through her floor. Laughter, conversation, the hum of community. It sounded warm. It sounded nice. It sounded like everything she couldn't let herself have because grief made you a burden, and burdens drove people away. She picked up her phone and opened the text thread with Marcus. His last message was from 4 days ago, a photo of his new office view, all glass and city skyline. She'd hearted it but hadn't responded with words. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard. She wanted to type, I'm not okay, I miss you, I need you, come home. But that felt needy and desperate and exactly like the kind of emotional intensity that had driven her last boyfriend away. I don't want to bother you, she typed instead, then deleted it before sending. In the walls around her, something rustled. Melissa froze, phone still in hand. That sound. Paper. Definitely paper. Shuffling and sorting like someone was organising documents in the space between her walls. She held her breath, listening. Click, snap. Her heart jumped. That was a stapler. She knew that sound, had heard it 1,000 times in offices and schools. Someone was stapling something inside her walls. Hello, she called out, her voice shaky. Is someone there? The rustling stopped. Then, slowly, deliberately, a piece of paper slid under her door. Melissa stared at it, her pulse pounding in her ears. She should leave it there, should ignore it, should go downstairs to the potluck and surround herself with people and noise and distraction. But instead, she walked to the door, knelt down and picked up the paper. It was a flyer, formatted, like all the others on the bulletin board. At the top, lost. Lost. Melissa Torres's child. Lost at 11 weeks. Name never chosen, gender never known, future never realised. Gone but not forgotten, except Melissa is trying very hard to forget because remembering hurts too much. Also, lost. Melissa's relationship. Marcus is building a life in Portland and she's building walls here. They talk less, mean less, drift further. She tells herself it's mutual, but she knows she's the one pulling away, protecting him from her grief by disappearing into it. Also, lost. Melissa's permission to grieve. She thinks 3 months is too long to still be sad. She thinks her pain is too much for other people. She thinks needing support makes her weak. She thinks all of this while dying inside. If found, please return to 3F. She won't ask for it herself. Melissa's hands shook so badly the paper rattled. Every word was true. Every private thought she'd been hiding was laid out in neat printed text. The building knew. The board knew. Something in this place had been listening to her thoughts, cataloguing her isolation, preparing to expose her the way it had exposed Sarah Chen. She crumpled the paper and threw it across the room, then immediately regretted it, because what if someone found it? What if it magically appeared on the bulletin board downstairs for everyone at the potluck to read? I don't want to bother anyone with my problems, she thought desperately, and the walls around her began to hum. Not a mechanical hum, something else. Something organic and hungry and very, very patient. The sound of paper rubbing against paper, thousands of sheets moving together, creating friction and heat and something like consciousness. Melissa ran to her door and yanked it open, ready to flee downstairs to the potluck, to the people, the safety of community. But the hallway was wrong. The walls were covered in flyers, floor to ceiling, every surface papered over with notices, all of them. About her, her name repeated hundreds of times in different fonts. Melissa Torres, Melissa Torres, Melissa Torres. And words, so many words, exposing everything she'd been hiding. Needed. Someone to tell Melissa that miscarriage isn't failure, that her body isn't broken, that grief doesn't have an expiration date. Lost. Melissa's faith that she deserves good things, lost gradually over 3 months of telling herself to get over it. Needed. Someone to hold space for Melissa's sadness without trying to fix it or minimize it or rush her through it. Lost. Melissa's ability to ask for help, buried under years of being told she's too sensitive, too emotional, too much. Melissa backed into her apartment and slammed the door, her breath coming in gasps. This wasn't real. Couldn't be real. Buildings didn't collect your thoughts. Walls didn't know your secrets. But the flyer she'd thrown was back, sitting on her coffee table uncrumpled, pristine. Next to it sat a blank piece of paper and a pushpin. Melissa stared at them, understanding flooding through her like cold water. The ritual. Sarah had mentioned it at coffee last week. Something about pinning a blank page and forgiving yourself. Something about the board only taking you if you said the words out loud. I don't want to bother anyone with my problems. She'd thought it so many times. But she hadn't said it. Not out loud. There was still a chance. Melissa picked up the blank paper with shaking hands, went to her door, opened it slowly. The hallway was still wrong, still covered in flyers about her grief and loss and carefully hidden needs. But at the far end she could see the stairwell, still clear, still offering escape. She could run, go downstairs, join the potluck, confess everything to strangers who might actually care. Or she could do the ritual, pin the blank page, forgive herself, hope that was enough. Her feet carried her toward the stairwell, toward the sound of laughter and community rising from below. But with each step more flyers appeared, covering her path, making it harder to move forward. They stuck to her feet, wrapped around her ankles, climbed her legs like living things. Needed. Someone to tell Melissa it's okay to not be okay. Lost. Melissa's future. The one where she was a mother. Needed. Someone to love Melissa enough to wait while she heals. She was waist-deep in paper now, wading through confession she'd never made, sinking into the weight of her own denied need. The laughter from downstairs was getting fainter, or maybe she was getting farther from it, pulled backward by the tide of her own isolation. I don't want to bother anyone with my problems, she thought. And the papers rose higher, reaching her chest, her shoulders, her neck. She started to say, but caught herself. If she said it out loud, she was gone, disappeared like James Wu, filed away in the building's permanent collection. Instead, Melissa took the blank paper she'd been clutching, and held it up like a shield. I forgive myself, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I forgive myself for losing the baby. I forgive myself for grieving. I forgive myself for needing people. I forgive myself for not being okay. The papers stopped moving. The hallway held its breath. I forgive myself for being scared to ask for help, Melissa continued, her voice getting stronger. I forgive myself for thinking my pain is too much. I forgive myself for all of it. She pressed the blank paper against the nearest wall and held it there, palm flat, the way Marcus had described doing it downstairs. She didn't have a pushpin, but she held it anyway, held it until her arm ached, held it until the paper underneath started to feel warm, like it was accepting her offering. The flyers covering the hallway began to peel away, falling like autumn leaves, drifting to the floor in gentle spirals. The walls returned to normal, cheap paint and water stains and all the ordinary damage of a 70-year-old building. Melissa lowered her hand. The blank paper stayed where she'd pressed it, somehow adhered to the wall without any visible means of attachment. It hung there, white and blank and final. She walked to the stairwell, her legs shaky, and descended toward the sound of the potluck, toward people, toward the terrifying possibility of letting someone see her broken and loving her anyway. Derek saw her first as she reached the lobby. Melissa, hey, you made it. Are you okay? You look... I had a miscarriage 3 months ago, Melissa heard herself say, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. And I've been pretending I'm fine, but I'm not fine. I'm really not fine. And my boyfriend is moving on with his life in Portland, and I'm here alone, and I don't know how to ask for help because I don't want to be a burden. The lobby went quiet. Everyone turned to look at her. Melissa felt heat rise to her face, felt the familiar urge to take it all back, to say she was kidding or making a weird joke or just stressed from work. Then Sarah was there, pulling her into a hug. Thank you for telling us, Sarah said quietly. That took courage. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Rodriguez added, her eyes wet. Mia, you shouldn't have to carry that alone. College kids offered awkward but sincere condolences. Eric squeezed her shoulder. Other people she barely knew expressed sympathy that seemed genuine. And Melissa realised that sharing her pain hadn't driven anyone away. It had let them in. It had given them permission to care. She spent the rest of the evening at the potluck, talking and crying and laughing, feeling more present in her body than she had in months. People shared their own losses, their own struggles. The building started to feel less like a collection of isolated units and more like an actual community. Later, after the food was gone, and people started drifting back to their apartments, Melissa walked to the bulletin board. She pulled out a sticky note and wrote, "Thank you to everyone who listened tonight. I've been so scared to need people, but you all made it easy. Melissa, 3F." She stuck it to the board next to all the responses to Sarah's flyer, adding her voice to the growing chorus of people who'd decided that isolation wasn't strength after all. The board's fluorescent light flickered, and for just a second, Melissa thought she saw something in the reflection of the glass. A tall figure made of paper and staples smiling with approval, or maybe with hunger. Sometimes it was hard to tell the difference. She went upstairs to her apartment. The blank paper was still on her hallway wall. Now her door was different, covered in sticky notes from her neighbours. "If you need anything, I'm in 3B, day or night. Rachel. Coffee this week. I'd love to hear more about what you're going through. Sarah. My sister had 3 miscarriages before having her kids. Happy to connect you if you want to talk to someone who's been there. Mrs. R." Melissa collected the notes with tears running down her face. Good tears this time. Grateful tears. She went inside and, for the first time in 3 months, called Marcus. "Hey," she said when he answered, his voice thick with sleep because it was 3 hours earlier in Portland. "I'm not doing okay. I need you to know that. I need you to care about that. And if you can't care about that, then I need you to tell me now so I can start figuring out how to move on." It wasn't the script she'd planned. It was too honest, too raw, too needy. But it was true. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I'm so sorry. I thought you wanted space. I thought you wanted me to give you room to process. I've been trying to give you what I thought you needed." "I needed you," Melissa said. "I still need you. But I also need to learn how to ask for that instead of expecting you to guess." They talked for 2 hours, made a plan. Marcus would fly back next weekend. They'd go to couples counselling. They'd figure it out or they wouldn't, but at least they'd try honestly instead of letting isolation and unexpressed needs kill what they had. When Melissa finally hung up and went to bed, she fell asleep easier than she had in months. The building was quiet around her, peaceful, like it had gotten what it wanted. Another person choosing connection over isolation. The board was already watching the next target. In apartment 4A, Trevor Fan lay in bed scrolling through his phone, looking at photos from the potluck he'd seen but not attended. He'd been invited, had even put it in his calendar, but when the time came, the thought of making small talk with strangers had filled him with dread so intense he'd had to take an anxiety medication and lie in the dark until it passed. "I don't want to bother anyone," he thought, swiping past another group photo where everyone looked happy and comfortable and capable of normal social interaction. In the walls, paper began to rustle, and in the lobby, behind the glass of the bulletin board, Staple Mercy smiled its staple smile and waited. Because the building had all the time in the world, and there would always be more people who said the words, who thought their isolation was strength, who drowned quietly rather than risk bothering someone with their need. The board would wait, would watch, would collect, would file every swallowed plea into its permanent archive, and the building would keep speaking in their voices, begging with words they were too scared to say themselves, until someone finally listened or they disappeared into the walls entirely. Forever cataloguing, forever filing, forever hungry for the help you almost asked for. In the rain-dim lobby, Staple Mercy doesn't punish you for needing help. It just collects the moment you deny it, and pins that denial up until the building starts asking in your name. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. Rain pounds the highway in heavy sheets, turning every lane into a ribbon of black glass. Marcus Chen's hands grip the steering wheel at 10 and 2, knuckles bone white in the dashboard glow. He's been driving for 6 hours straight, chasing a deadline that stopped mattering somewhere around hour 4. The wipers drag across the windshield in their rhythmic scrape. Left, right, left, right. But they can't keep up with the downpour. Taillights ahead smear into red comets that stretch and wobble through the water streaming across the glass, making the highway look like it's melting into itself. His eyes burn. That dry, sandy feeling that comes from staring at white lines for too long. He blinks hard, trying to reset, but his vision just blurs at the edges. The GPS on his phone says another hour and 40 minutes to home. The storm is making a liar out of every estimate. Traffic has slowed to a crawl. He can barely see past the semi-truck ahead of him, its massive bulk throwing up. Spray that turns his windshield into a wall of water every few seconds. The sound inside the car is hypnotic. Tyres on wet pavement making that steady hush, wipers dragging their rubber tongues across glass, rain hammering the roof like 1,000 fingers tapping for attention. His thoughts feel loose, untethered. He keeps forgetting what he was just thinking about. Work, the presentation. Karen from accounting who said that thing about his numbers being off. None of it matters now. Out here on the highway at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, drowning in rain, the whole world shrinks down to staying in your lane and not hitting the car in front of you. An exit sign appears through the downpour. Cedar Grove, 1 mile. He doesn't recognise the name, but that doesn't matter. His body makes the decision before his brain catches up. His hands turn the wheel. The car drifts right, crossing lanes, following the curve of the exit ramp as it peels away from the highway. The taillights ahead vanish, swallowed by rain and distance. Now it's just him and the storm. The exit dumps him onto a frontage road that runs parallel to the highway, separated by a concrete barrier and about 50 yards of scrubby grass turned to mud. There's nothing out here. No gas stations, no rest stops, just darkness and the skeletal shapes of trees bending in the wind. But there's an overpass up ahead, one of those wide concrete structures that carries the highway over a secondary road. You can see the shelter it offers, the way the rain doesn't quite reach underneath. His foot eases off the gas. The car slows. He guides it under the overpass and stops, putting the transmission in park. The change is immediate. The hammering rain becomes muted, distant, like someone turned down the volume on the world. Water still pours off the edges of the overpass above him, creating curtains of falling water on either side of the car. Here in this concrete pocket there's a strange quiet. He can hear his own breathing. The tick of the cooling engine, the wind pushing against the car in irregular gusts. Concrete pillars loom on either side like quiet sentries, each one thick enough to hide a person. The world outside looks distant and watery, shapes moving and shifting through the rain curtains. He exhales, grateful to stop moving for a moment, grateful to let his hands rest, his eyes close, his mind drift. He's so tired. The kind of tired that makes your teeth ache. The kind that makes you forget things, like when you last ate, or whether you locked the front door this morning, or why you thought driving through a storm like this was a good idea. He should call someone. Let them know he's okay, just waiting out the weather. But his phone is at 4% battery and he doesn't want to waste it. Besides, who would he call? His apartment is empty. His girlfriend left 3 months ago, took the cat and the good coffee maker. His parents are asleep in Phoenix 3 time zones away. His co-workers wouldn't answer. Friends. Does he have those anymore? People he used to drink with, sure, but that's not the same thing. The loneliness hits him like a fist to the chest. Sudden. Physical. He leans forward until his forehead touches the steering wheel. Cold plastic against hot skin. He stays like that, breathing, trying to remember when things stopped feeling manageable. It wasn't one moment, it was an erosion. Days piled on days, choices made and then forgotten, until he ended up here, 34 years old, alone in a car under an overpass, so tired he could cry but too numb to manage it. "Someone guide me," he whispers to the empty car. The words come out cracked and small. "Someone take over, just get me there." He doesn't mean it as anything serious. It's just the kind of thing people say when they're exhausted and scared, and don't want to admit how close they are to simply giving up control. But the moment the words leave his mouth, something changes. The hazard. Lights. He doesn't remember turning them on, but there they are, blinking in perfect mechanical rhythm. Click, blink, click, blink, click, blink. 2 seconds between each flash. The sound is crisp in the quiet under the overpass. The orange light reflects off the wet pavement outside, creating little pools of warning that pulse and fade, pulse and fade. Then the rhythm changes. It's subtle at first. The blinks stretch out, becoming longer. Not by much, maybe half a second, but enough to notice. Click, blink, click, blink, click, blink. Too calm now, too even, like a heartbeat that isn't the car's. The blinking feels less like a warning and more like a lull, something trying to soothe him. He stares at the button on the dashboard, the little red triangle, expecting it to be stuck or malfunctioning. But it looks normal. It looks fine. The dashboard glow warms. He feels it before he sees it. A subtle increase in temperature coming from the instrument cluster, the normal blue-white. Light that illuminates the speedometer and fuel gauge and temperature readouts begins to shift. It takes on a softer quality, losing its LED sharpness and gaining something older, more organic, candle-like. The plastic itself seems to be holding a small flame behind it, casting shadows that flicker and dance across the steering wheel, across his hands. Marcus blinks hard. He's seeing things. Has to be. Fatigue hallucinations. He read about that once. How tired drivers start perceiving things that aren't there, their brains filling in gaps with false information. That's all this is. Neurons misfiring, synapses getting their wires crossed. The light keeps warming. It brightens when his fingers tense on the wheel like it's noticing. When he loosens his grip, it dims slightly, then brightens again when he tightens. It's learning him. Learning the shape of his fatigue, the rhythm of his tension, the places where he's weak. Voltage glitch, he says out loud, his voice rough. Just the rain. Just the cold. But even as he says it, he knows it's not true. The warmth in the light feels intentional. Comfort offered by something that wants to be trusted. Like a stranger who smiles too wide, who stands too close, who offers help before you've asked for it. His phone buzzes in the cup holder. A text from work. He doesn't look at it. The screen casts a pale glow, then dims, then goes dark. Battery at 3%. He should probably turn it off to save what's left, but he can't make himself reach for it. His hands stay on the wheel, palms damp with sweat despite the chill in the air. The windshield begins to fog. It shouldn't. The defroster is on. He can hear it blowing, feel the warm air on his shins. The frost creeps across the glass from the edges inward, creating delicate fern patterns that grow and spread. Then the frost melts in one specific spot. A perfect oval, maybe 8 inches across, right at eye level. It clears completely for a moment. Transparent, glass, and then fogs over again, clears, fogs, clears, fogs, like breathing. Inhale, mist spreads across the oval, obscuring the view. Exhale, the glass clears, showing the rain-soaked darkness beyond. The rhythm is steady, human. The oval is positioned exactly where a face would be if someone were standing just outside the car, leaning close to the windshield, their breath condensing on the cold glass. Marcus feels his pulse spike. His heart kicks against his ribs like it's trying to escape. He stares at the breathing oval, at the precise shape of it, how it holds its form even as the frost around it continues to spread and shift. There's no one outside. He can see that. The space beyond the windshield is empty except for rain and shadow and the concrete pillar about 10 feet ahead. The oval keeps breathing, keeps fogging and clearing with metronomic precision. He reaches forward with one shaking hand and wipes the inside of the windshield. His palm comes away wet. The glass, on his side, is fine, clear and dry. The fog is coming from the outside. Someone is breathing on his windshield from the outside, in the rain, under the overpass where no one should be. His hand drops back to the wheel. He should drive. Right now. Just put the car in gear and get the hell out from under this overpass and back onto the highway, where there are lights and other people, and some semblance of normal reality. But he can't make himself move. His body feels heavy, pinned to the seat by exhaustion and something else. Something like curiosity or dread, or the terrible fascination of watching a wound open. Outside, puddles have gathered near the shoulder of the road. They're unavoidable in rain like this. Water pools in every low spot, every crack in the pavement, creating dark mirrors that reflect the underside of the overpass and the car's faint parking lights. Marcus's eyes drift to one of these puddles, a large one about 15 feet to the right of his front bumper. In near the reflection, he sees his car. It's rolling forward, slowly, incrementally. The tyres are turning, the body shifting, moving down an invisible road. He can see the suspension compress slightly as it travels over some unseen bump. The reflection shows his car in motion, cruising at maybe 5 miles per hour, crawling forward through the dark water of the puddle. But his car isn't moving. Marcus looks down at his feet. His foot is on the brake. The car is in park. The parking brake is engaged. He can see the little red light on the dashboard. When he looks back at the puddle, the reflection continues its quiet crawl. The car in the water drives on as if the road has decided movement is inevitable, as if his choice in the matter is irrelevant. Hazard lights blink in that slow, steady rhythm. Flick, blink, flick, blink. The sound fills the car like a heartbeat. The dashboard glow pulses in time with it, warm and soft and almost tender. The breathing oval on the windshield continues its cycle. Fog, clear, perfectly synchronized with the hazards, with the glow, with his own ragged breathing. He realizes, with a cold shock that travels down his spine like ice water, that his car is becoming a shrine. The dashboard glow is a votive candle, guttering and warm. The rain is incense, sweet and heavy and intoxicating. The overpass is a low, sheltering ceiling, a concrete temple built for some purpose he doesn't understand. And he is the supplicant, hands on the wheel, waiting for an answer to a prayer he didn't know he'd said. "Just take me home," he whispers. The words slip out before he can stop them. "Please, just take me home." Dashboard light brightens. It flares like a candle catching a fresh draft. The glow spreading across the interior of the car, making everything look soft and safe and warm. The hazard rhythm doesn't change, but it feels different now. Approving, satisfied, like something has been fed. The breathing oval presses closer to the glass. He can see it now, really see it. The oval is fogging in a pattern that suggests nostrils, a mouth, the humidity of lungs. Whatever is breathing on his windshield is patient. It can wait. It has time. Marcus feels his hands relax on the wheel. The tension drains out of his shoulders. His eyelids grow heavy. The fear that was screaming in his chest moments ago begins to fade, replaced by something warm and thick and slow. Relief. Finally, someone else is handling it. Finally, he can rest. His right foot slides off the brake. The car doesn't move. It's still in park. The intention is there. The willingness. The surrender. He feels his hand drift toward the gear shift. All he has to do is pull it down into drive. That's it. One small motion and whatever is offering him comfort in the warm dashboard glow will take care of the rest. It will guide him. It will take over. It will get him there. Where is there? The question surfaces in his mind like a bubble, rising through mud. Slow, reluctant, but impossible to ignore once it arrives. Where exactly does he think he's going? Home. His apartment with its empty rooms and broken garbage disposal, and the stain on the carpet where the cat used to throw up. Is that home? Or is home just a word, a concept, a destination that feels familiar for a moment and then wrong the second you arrive? His hand hovers over the gear shift. The warm glow brightens, encouraging. The breathing oval fogs and clears, fogs and clears. The puddle shows his car rolling onward, tyres turning, going somewhere in the reflected world where decisions have already been made. Then, from somewhere deep in the part of his brain that's still functioning, still alert, still tethered to reality, a memory surfaces. A story he heard years ago told by a trucker at a rest stop in Montana. Marcus had been driving cross-country, fresh out of college, heading to his first real job. The trucker was old, weathered, with hands like leather and eyes that had seen too many miles. He'd told Marcus about something called drift votive. "It lives in the car," the trucker had said, pouring another cup of coffee from a thermos that looked older than Marcus. Behind the dashboard, in the wires and the plastic and the places where warmth gathers, it doesn't steal cars, it steals the quiet wish a driver makes when they're too tired to choose. "Someone guide me," he'd say. "Someone take over. Just get me there." And drift votive listens. It feeds on that surrender, grows strong on it. Marcus had laughed it off as road superstition, the kind of ghost story truckers tell each other to stay awake. The old man had grabbed his wrist, fingers tight, and looked him dead in the eye. If your dashboard light starts glowing like a candle, you turn the hazards off. You put both hands flat on the wheel, and you decide, really decide, whether you're resting or driving. No half promises, no just for a minute, no I'll see how I feel. You make the choice clean, and you keep your mouth shut. Don't say, "Take me home." Don't give it permission, because once you do, it's not your car anymore. It's a shrine, and you're the offering. The trucker had released his wrist and gone back to his coffee like nothing had happened. Marcus had driven away thinking the old man was senile or drunk or both. Now, sitting under an overpass with a dashboard that glows like candlelight, and a windshield that breathes and a puddle that shows him driving even when he's still, the story doesn't feel like superstition anymore. It feels like a warning he should have heeded. His hand jerks back from the gear shift. His breath comes faster. The warm fog in his brain begins to clear, burned away by a sudden spike of adrenaline. He looks at the hazard button, that little red triangle still blinking its slow hypnotic rhythm, and reaches for it. The resistance is immediate, not physical. He can move his hand fine, his fingers close on the button without any actual barrier. But there's an emotional weight, a psychological pressure that makes his hand feel like it's pushing through molasses. It's the feeling of losing the only comfort in the storm, of giving up the warmth, of choosing the hard, lonely path when something soft and easy is right there, offering to help. His finger trembles on the button. The dashboard glow pulses brighter, as if sensing his hesitation. The breathing oval fogs larger, spreading across more of the windshield. In the puddle, his car accelerates slightly, eager, ready. "No," Marcus says through clenched teeth. "No, Fuck you. No. He presses the button. The hazards stop. The absence of the rhythm is shocking. The car falls into silence, broken only by the rain outside and his own ragged breathing. The interior feels instantly colder, darker, like someone blew out a candle. The warm glow in the dashboard doesn't disappear immediately. It fades slowly, reluctantly, like something that doesn't want to go. You can almost feel it retreating, pulling back into the wires and plastic seams, shrinking down into whatever small space it occupies when it's not being fed. His hands shake as he places them flat on the steering wheel. Palms down, fingers spread. The wheel is cold and slick with condensation. He presses hard, feeling the reality of it, the solidness, grounding himself to something real and physical and his. Now comes the decision. Rest or drive. One or the other. No bargaining. No negotiations with himself about just 5 more minutes, or just until the rain lets up, or just until I feel more awake. The choice has to be clean. Has to be honest. He has to look at himself. Really look. And decide what he's capable of right now. He's exhausted. That's not in question. His eyes burn. His back aches. His thoughts are sluggish and imprecise. The idea of getting back on the highway, merging into traffic, maintaining focus for another hour and 40 minutes makes him want to weep. The alternative, staying here under this overpass with whatever lurks in warm dashboard light, that's worse. That's surrender of a different kind. That's saying I can't, and meaning it forever. He looks at the puddle. The reflection of his car has stopped moving. It sits motionless in the dark water, waiting. The breathing oval on the windshield has collapsed into random fog patterns, messy and chaotic, no longer shaped like exhalation. The dashboard is just a dashboard again. Normal blue-white LED light showing his speed, his fuel level, his RPMs. The world has returned to being difficult but honest. Marcus makes his choice. He chooses to drive. Not because he wants to, but because he has to. Because staying here means giving in to something he doesn't understand and can't control. Because the longer he sits, the harder it will be to leave. Because home, real home, whatever that means, is forward, not in this concrete shrine under a highway overpass. He keeps his mouth closed. The urge to speak is enormous, to whisper, okay, I can do this, or just get me home safe, or any of the 100 small prayers people say to make hard things feel manageable. But he remembers the trucker's warning. Don't give it permission. Don't offer it words to feed on. The decision is made in silence, held in his chest like a secret,